Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking at this conference, though unfortunately, my co-presenter Miriam Kalimo and myself could not make it to Cambridge in person. I want to thank the organizers of this conference for the intellectual and political commitment that they have to engage with the discussion of decolonization and academic institutions in the UK, and their particular interest in the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford campaign. So I want to begin with this picture of myself in 2014 that was taken as part of the I Too Am Oxford campaign. The campaign highlighted microaggressions that were a result of the lack of diversity at the university. The approach was very different from the Rose Must Fall movement. As you can see in the picture, the sun is setting, but I still got my shades on. I'm annoyed but unfazed. It was a moment where we preferred using sarcasm, irony, or just, explicit mockery, and really centering on humor to draw attention to the problems of diversity at Oxford and how they influenced me specifically as a Zimbabwean student. I was mocking both myself and the institution. Here I am, the voice of Africa, well, because there are no other Africans in my tutorial. But what power does that even give you in an institution like Oxford? I'm the black voice of Africa because white Africanists dominate the African center and even literature that I was studying at that time. So, what power do I have as a black African Zimbabwean student? And my last phrase was, yo, you guys gotta watch out because I tell a lot of stories. And this was a playful ending to say that while I have very little influence, the only way to really live with this marginalization is to laugh about it, to kind of provoke people, make up absurd stories, and see the types of things that people still actually believe about Africa and the stereotypes that, everyone is a refugee or, just ridiculous concepts that now we would say are extremely unnuanced. So I started with the previous picture of myself 2 years ago to demonstrate the shift in strategies that happened between the ITERM Oxford campaign in 2014 and the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford campaign that happened the next academic year, but really sparked a lot of debate in 2016. And I chose this second picture of a march that we did earlier on this year to think through the question, what happens when we as students stop using humor and seriously ask about what we are actually owed in our education? What happens when we start talking about diversity and start talking about decolonization? And instead of focusing on individual experiences, focusing on the institution itself. So, on the side of this picture from the Rose Must Fall page on Facebook is this comment that, sarcastically says, look how oppressed all of these Oxford students are, especially the ones getting a free education. And this comment kind of mimics various reactions that our movement has gotten from the media and from various university officials and even some of our peers. And these antagonistic comments reveal that something is at stake when African students reject the role of being passive recipients of knowledge and instead take a more active role, reacting and creating alternative forms of knowledge production. So initially, I had titled this paper Rhodes Must Fall Oxford, Decolonization and the Myth of Western Neutrality at the University of Oxford. And while I will touch on the ways that Oxford tried to frame itself as a neutral and accommodating institution that upholds, as our Chancellor Lord Patton likes to say, Western ideals of debate and democracy, I would like to refocus this presentation on the questions that I've already touched upon. I will briefly try to respond to three broad questions using the specific example of roads must fall. The first is an annoying but relevant one. Can Africans think for themselves? The second, what happens when that active thinking results in activism? And third, if we agree, as we should, that Africans can think for themselves, then what needs to shift within institutions like Oxford in regards to how they see students that challenge the institution and want to discuss particularly institutional racism? And so, to begin with my first question, can Africans think? It's obviously a question that is directed at a very particular audience, like an audience at a place like Oxford University or Cambridge University. But just to put things in context, I recently finished my master's in women's studies at Oxford, and while the course is known to be more political and progressive than other courses might be, there was only racial diversity in the form of African American scholarship, but a visible lack of sub Saharan African feminist theory. As I said before, the African Studies department at Oxford is particularly known to be overwhelmingly white. And this lack of representation is why the question, can Africans think for themselves, is so often brought up. Oxford's position as a leading global university, even in subjects like African studies, is obviously related to the history of colonization and the orientation of the empire towards institutions like Oxford as places of knowledge production and abundant resources. I want to stress, however, that I think Europe being an intellectual center has shifted a while ago and continues to, but that the inevitability of this shift is what makes movements like Roads Must Fall Oxford so threatening. However, I also don't want to downplay the influence that institutions like Oxford have on global academic discourses, and that is particularly why Oxford is an important site for decolonization. So, this next picture was taken during an interview with Tokozo Kwabe, who is a part of the Rhodes Must Fall Oxford movement, and Sophia Cannon. And they were debating Rhodes's legacy in Oxford University. And Sophia Cannon said something interesting. She claimed that Rhodes scholars are the gift of Africa and the positive product of the colonial project. This claim was so absurd and dramatic, we just had to make a meme about it because we still like to use humor from time to time to engage with people's ridiculous responses to the movement. But this does lead to my second point about what happens when Black African students can think and therefore react, challenge, and demand from an institution like Oxford. Rhodes Must Fall Oxford has not shied away from ambitious but important demands. We defined decolonization in three categories: iconography, curriculum, and representation. And we have asked for, particular things to change in each of these three categories. And the university really started to respond to our movement um, after the November protest at Oriel College, which was the first time that we publicly asked for the statue to be removed. Initially, Oriel College agreed to remove the plaque celebrating Rhodes and to begin a listening exercise for 6 months to debate the removal of the statue. While Rhodes Must Fall Oxford engaged in debates leading up to this listening exercise, the listening exercise was promptly shut down before it really started because donors had threatened to take away funding from the college. And also during this time, the Chancellor of Oxford would say something kind of ironic given that the debate was stopped by donors. And I'm just gonna concentrate on a specific line he said, which was, quote, "Can you imagine a university where there is no platform? If you want universities like that, you go to China, where they're not allowed to talk about Western values, which I regard as global values. No, it's not the way a university should operate." And he said this in response to Rhodes Must Fall Oxford protest that the statue should be removed. And I think in response to Lord Patton's comments, the question, can Africans think, becomes relevant again. And this question becomes relevant because we have to ask, well, can the ways we challenge the institution and the ideas we bring when we challenge the institution also be regarded as global values? And I actually think that the global student movements, whether it be, I too am Harvard, Royale Must Fall, and of course Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa, have begun to map out alternative ways that actually we can have a conversation, and a global conversation that is not centered on prioritizing, this romanticized notion of Western values. So, my last question is one that will be very brief and I think will be central for the movement next year. And the question is, if we reject being passive recipients of knowledge as students, then what do we think must change in institutions like Oxford? And of course, I recently finished my program, but what I found interesting was this new project that was happening recently called Diversifying Portraiture at Oxford. And it was obviously a response to Rhodes Must Fall. And it is this strange attempt to just start adding random portraits of people of color all over the university, while also refusing to take down any problematic figures, white men in particular. And so then we have to ask, is this meaningful change to just add people of color, but never once again wrestle with this myth of Western neutrality, with this uncritical engagement of Rhodes' legacy, with this uncritical engagement of, the history of colonization? Are these surface projects, just diversity without decolonization? And I think movements like Rhodes Must Fall Oxford sometimes can make institutions want to quickly make these surface changes, and it's our particular role to push these institutions to do more. Thank you.